Welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Emily Fakey. I work here at the Center for Global Development. I'm really excited to share our panel with you today. Delighted to introduce you to them as they're getting seated. So directly on my left is Rebecca Smith, who is a migration policy analyst in the World Bank's Social Protection and Labor Practice. She specializes in building migration systems in sending and receiving countries. Currently, she's the lead consultant on a technical assistance program for the government of Afghanistan to design and build its nascent labor sending system. On her left is Ami Amin, who currently works at the Millennium Challenge Corporation as a policy officer on the selection and eligibility team. Prior to the MCC, Ami held positions at the State Department and the Office of Foreign Assistance, and at USAID working in PEPFAR monitoring and evaluation. Kate Wathen is a global communications professional with DevEx. She previously served as a press officer with USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, oversaw media relations for the Center of Global Development, and managed consumer PR and crisis communications for Kaiser Permanente. On her left is Krishnan Raghavan, who is a second-year MA student in International Development and Conflict Management at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Krishnan previously spent 2 years in Nairobi, Kenya, managing humanitarian relief programs in Somalia with the International Rescue Committee. And finally, Janine Madan is a policy analyst here at the Center for Global Development, where she focuses on global health issues. Janine previously spent 2 years in Dakar, Senegal, where she worked with the UN World Food Programme supporting nutrition and food security programs across West Africa. So thank you so much again for being here with us today. I'm going to start off with a challenging question for you all on challenges. So in 10 to 15 years, what do you think will be the most urgent challenge in international development, or challenges? Right now, which of these receive too little attention, and what concrete steps can development professionals take to better address them? And we'll start here with Rebecca.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start with two answers. And the first is kind of a broader theme, and that is that everything you're going to hear us talk about today, and I'm entirely certain like everything that you in the audience work on as well, the crises that we face are crises that inherently transcend borders, right? I mean, you can't contain health or the environment or many of the other things that we're going to talk about to one country, right? But our primary actors in responding to them are still national governments. So I think that the main thing that we need is a coordinated global approach to producing global public goods from organizations like CGD, which does an excellent job on that. But the second answer is probably, I think, why I was asked to speak here today, and that would be the imminent increase in migration. If you look at demographic factors, labor shortages in many countries paired with labor surpluses in many, in sending countries. If you look at conflict trends, if you look at climate change trends, all of these, and when you look at the vast wage differentials that have been, again, written about mainly here at CGD, they all point to one thing, which is that in the coming decades and centuries, people are going to move more and more and more. And if you think about the refugee crisis, and I hesitate to use that word, in Europe right now, honestly, those levels are so low to what we can expect to come in coming decades. And the problem that we're seeing is that we don't, again, have that coordinated approach, right? So it seems like a difficult thing to say that what we need to focus on right now in this current political environment is migration, right? But what we've always found is that even in the most difficult of political economy circumstances, you can always find a technical solution and a technical approach to coordination that allows you to move the agenda forward. So my answer in terms of tangible things that we could do would be to look for tools that allow you to align labor market institutions across borders. A great one, my favorite example of that was written about here, global skills partnerships, which addresses the issue of skill accumulation in one country and movement to another by making it work for both employers and workers in both countries. So looking for technical things like that allow people to move and allow them to harness the benefits of movement while continuing to operate in this environment.
Thank you. We'll continue with you, Ami.
So I agree with everything, and I come from a health background, so I'm going to speak specifically about health. And I think a lot of what Rebecca said is applicable, in particular to global public goods. And we see that in the examples of Zika and Ebola and crises that emerge from communicable diseases. But as incomes rise, those health systems will certainly need to become more robust to be able to deal with those broad-scale communicable diseases, but also non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and heart issues and cancer. So as low-income economies start developing these sort of higher profiles of diabetes, they're going to need to come up with sort of the resources to finance that as well. The way that the high-income world looks at it is it's a chronic disease, and we should just continue to pay for it for forever until the person lives. And that's unfortunately not a sustainable approach for the low-income world. And so we need to think about that more critically, whether we address it from a behavioral angle or how we finance or how we think about those issues. And no health system is perfect, and there's no silver bullet for how we should think about health systems. But really, we need to be thinking about three critical aspects of health systems, which includes having the right resources geared towards the right people. Are people getting the right resources when they need them? And also, are there sufficient skills to address what we need them to address? And can we operate in a financial situation that is sustainable?
So obviously I agree. I think that health system strengthening is crucial, especially looking 10, 15 years from now. But I actually see, in addition to that, a giant challenge in communications. I think that international development professionals are great at talking to each other, but not necessarily people on the outside. And I think this is problematic for two reasons. I think the most obvious is the current administration has very clearly signaled that it's still talking to its voter base, which turns to, you could call it non-traditional media outlets, kind of right-wing, more white right-wing outlets for its news, which means that the administration is also turning to those outlets to make policy decisions, which is not something that we've really seen before to this scale. So I think from a media standpoint, it's really important that if international development agencies and international development organizations want to build consensus that aid is a good thing, that we kind of need to move the needle on these international development priorities, it's time to change up the strategy and start meeting people where they are and maybe finding ways to work with some of these outlets and getting our message in there in a way that resonates. The other side of that, I just think that the second biggest challenge is harnessing this energy of this entire millennial generation that is very invested in having careers that make a difference in the world. I think, not to call you out 40-plus club, but you can moan and groan all you want about how much we use Snapchat, but this is a generation unlike any other that puts so much emphasis on trying to do meaningful work, making sure that they're leaving the world a better place, making sure that we are leaving the world a better place than we found it. And if you're looking at this through an international lens, I don't think there's any better industry to do that in than international development. So I would say, kind of a sort of a rebranding or rethinking of our messaging would be the most important way to move forward, and just, really taking a deep look inside and acknowledging that we can talk about these very complicated, intricate topics, but thinking about everyone outside of our industry and how to communicate that to them. Because nothing kills dinner conversation at my family's house in the Midwest like, oh yeah, I work in international development. So I would say communications.
Great. I would definitely echo everything my fellow panelists have said. But what I want to talk about specifically, having had a background in humanitarian aid and working primarily on issues here at CGD related to forced displacement and conflict, is that an increasing challenge for development actors is going to be finding productive ways to engage in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And traditionally, there's been sort of a siloed approach to this, where there are conflict management practitioners on one side, then kind of in the middle you have humanitarian actors who deal with immediate needs, but traditionally haven't looked at longer-term development sort of projects in their work streams. And then you have development actors who really have, in the past, tended to shy away from areas like conflict with a sort of political dimension to them. And it's clear, both in the current environment and moving forward, that that's an increasingly infeasible approach. by 2030, for example, the World Bank estimates that 46% of the global poor will be living in fragile and conflict-affected situations. So, I mean, even if development actors have a primary mandate to reduce poverty and inequality, it's very clear that that mandate is going to have to encompass engaging productively in conflict-affected states. And we see a lot of trends right now that point towards increasing conflict going forward, sad as it is to say. Like, issues like climate change, for example, are increasingly important drivers of conflict. If you look at, for example, the Horn of Africa, or even Syria, which actually stemmed from a dispute regarding water resources, climate change and environmental factors are a huge driver of conflict. Increasingly nationalistic policy agendas are also not very likely to have a positive impact vis-a-vis mitigating conflict. So this is clearly something that the global development community is going to have to learn to engage with productively. And coming to that, my recommendations for how to do that in a concrete way are, first of all, maybe engaging with actors who have greater experience and expertise working in these challenging situations. So developing stronger partnerships, for example, with humanitarian actors to sort of close the humanitarian development nexus. And also just having the temerity to maybe operate in contexts where development actors may have feared to go previously because of political or security considerations, finding ways to work around those areas. Innovation, I think, is another key way for actors to engage in this space. So constantly testing and evaluating new ways of operating that are tailored to the specific challenges of these contexts. And really an important part of that is not being afraid to fail. So if an approach doesn't work, learn from that and move on, trying something new. And addressing root causes. So this is something that's more of a specialty of the development community, tackling issues such as labor markets, or other critical development challenges, like, for example, strengthening governance around natural resource management. These are some positive ways that are more tailored to the technical expertise of the development community that can also mitigate conflict. So continuing to work on those issues, but perhaps with a greater lens on mitigating fragility and preventing conflict.
So switching gears a little bit, the big challenge for global development that I wanted to highlight today is antimicrobial resistance. So as many of you may or may not know, the misuse and overuse of antibiotic drugs, both in human medicine, but also in animal agriculture, is accelerating drug resistance. And the threat is only growing. And as Rebecca pointed out, this really is an example of a challenge that isn't limited to national boundaries. And estimates suggest that there might be as many as 10 million deaths a year by 2050 if AMR is left unchecked. And I think that this will have big implications for the globe, but I think these implications will be particularly pronounced in low and middle income countries, where diarrheal diseases, respiratory diseases still are among the leading causes of death. And I think that given this is such a multidimensional problem, I think global development professionals are going to have to focus on a wide range of responses to the problem. I think the link to the health sector is sometimes pretty evident to a lot of us, but I think this is a challenge that really straddles agriculture as well as environmental issues. So, while we need to focus on more investments in finding new drugs and finding new antibiotics in particular, I think we also need to think about how we can develop more robust data and surveillance systems in countries, both in human medicine, but also in the animal and livestock sectors. And I also think it's an issue that really has synergies with a lot of other efforts that link to a lot of the other SDGs. So for example, improving sanitation and improving access to clean water around the world is going to help reduce the spread of infectious diseases, which will in turn reduce the demand on antibiotics. And I think there is a growing understanding and recognition that controlling the spread of AMR really is a global public good, and this wouldn't be a CGD event if we didn't talk about global public goods. And there's increased evidence about how the cost of investing in addressing AMR is actually something that has a very, very high economic rate of return. So I'll end by saying that I will acknowledge that this issue is receiving a lot of attention on the global scale. The WHO has released a global action plan. The UN General Assembly is convening high-level meetings about AMR. But I still think there's a lot more left to be done, and it'll need to be, solutions will need to be thought of in truly a global way, much like Rebecca mentioned in her opening statements.
Great, thank you. So budget cuts are looming. We're all very aware of it. And I'm wondering, Ami and Rebecca, thinking you two maybe are feeling this very saliently right now. So let's start with Ami, if you could comment a little bit on this. So how should development professionals adapt to potential budget cuts? Let's assume they're gonna happen. Should they act to bolster the consensus behind international development? Should we say, the ship has sailed, let's focus on the private sector? What do you think?
So I do think that the private sector is going to play an increasingly important role in development, for sure. However, I would say know the relative advantage of your institution. You know, the public sector and NGOs have a lot to offer that can't be accomplished by the private sector, and leverage that advantage and see how you can make formidable partnerships that leverage that advantage.
Awesome. Rebecca, what do you think?
Echoing really what Ami said, I think that we're going to see a shift to just new actors in the space. I mean, you're seeing budget cuts from the global north, right? But I mean, we've been saying in the development world for years in institutions like my own, right, that we need to empower leaders in the global south to really harness the development agenda. And that hasn't happened, right? And why hasn't that happened? Because influence follows money. So I mean, I want to say that there's perhaps a silver lining here. Perhaps we kind of restructure who leads in development and we embrace that. We kind of lean into the change.
Awesome, thank you.
Ideally.
Any thoughts down here that you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this point about knowing the relative advantage of your institution and how great the work you were doing is totally critical. And I think the communication side of that would be finding the way to talk about it. You know, like the work that, of course, MCC does, there are just so many things that you can pick out that will relate to people who aren't in the international development space, and just finding a way to boil it down so that, you know, it's meaningful. Like, you know, people will hear, oh my God, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, it might go down in flames. And, you know, most people in this country are gonna be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. But if you say, this agency that makes a bunch of money for the government is gonna go away and then we're gonna have less money, like that might be like a more meaningful way to communicate that. So I think, you know, certainly like finding the value and then also finding the best way to make your case.
Yeah, I think just to echo a little bit both what Rebecca and Ami have touched on about new actors becoming increasingly relevant, and also what Kate spoke to about finding different ways to communicate with your audience. I think that yes, we're certainly seeing quite a paradigm shift from traditional donors and actors in the development space, particularly in the global north, but all is not necessarily lost. And I think that a key priority should be being strategic when engaging with these types of actors. So if a government is shifting towards aid policies that perhaps are more geared towards serving the national interest, point out how specific projects actually do serve the national interest. For example, in the conflict space, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if you can address the causes of a conflict before a conflict breaks out, you can prevent, you know, the attendant refugee crisis, economic disruptions, loss of life, etc., at a lower cost. And another part of that is making sure that all projects are implemented with an eye towards an evidence base, so that you're really showing how projects are cost effective, underpinned by rigorous evidence, and how they work. So kind of bringing a more business-like approach to a field where maybe traditionally the messaging has been more about feelings and an appeal to emotion.
Yeah, and then jumping off of Krishnan's point, I was also going to add that I think our ability to use evidence and different kinds of evidence that we can get from evaluations will be in the limelight as we try and build this consensus around the need for investing in development. I think impact is important, but I think, as Krishnan pointed out, really looking at cost and how we can get the most bang for our buck is going to be really in the limelight the next few years.
So thank you all. That's actually all the time we have for our panel. We're going to move on to our interactive portion now, but please join me in giving a big round of applause to our phenomenal panelists.